Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I wanted to talk for about maybe half an hour and hopefully leave some time for questions as well. Uh, if I do end up kind of repeating myself and you've already heard this story before, I hope that I don't repeat myself too often and I will be presenting some new things. But roughly what I'll be talking about is kind of a conclusion, if you will, an overview of 7 or 8 years of research, plus some new things that I think are quite exciting. Um, all of this stuff has been summarized in these two books that I've published recently, which I won't dwell on for interest of time. But I have realized kind of slowly but surely over the last half year or so that um, I'm wrong about some things. And so a lot of people have accused me, or not a lot, but some, of believing things that aren't true, which is effectively the same as believing in misinformation. And so after some reflection, I've concluded for myself that some of these accusations might be, correct. For instance, a couple of beliefs that I hold dear that after some reflection I'm no longer all that sure about are, for instance, Queen Elizabeth is a vampire. I used to believe this very strongly, but now she's been dead for quite a while and she hasn't risen from the dead yet, which to me means that, it's just becoming less and less likely that that was actually true, which, you know, sometimes you have to revise your own beliefs. There's nothing wrong with that. And the other belief that I cling to, even though it may or may not be true, and I could easily look it up, but I've chosen not to, is that the Dutch football team has never lost or even drawn against Norway. Um, Again, less and less sure over time, but I feel that that makes me, a relatively good case study for understanding not necessarily my own kind of belief system, but rather more in a more general sense, the psychology of misbeliefs. And so that's what I've been dedicating a lot of my time and efforts to in the last couple of years. And to start out, I think a historical perspective might be of some value, and that historical perspective is useful because the study of misinformation, kind of broadly defined, really took off in 2016. But I'm not so sure that we've really learned kind of the lessons from the past, or kind of put them in a new coat of paint, if you will, in the modern era. And so one of these lessons that I think is relevant to kind of reconsider or reevaluate or maybe reappraise to a certain degree is this one about tobacco. So in 1994, as some of you might know, there was a whistleblower who was known as Mr. Butts, and hilarious name, I know, but that was really his name. Leaked about 4,000 documents to Stanton Glantz, who at the time was a professor at the University of California, which revealed the disinformation playbook that tobacco companies use to delay and soften legislation. And that playbook looks like this, consists of three components, at least according to the documents that were sent. There might have been slight minor revisions ever since, but broadly speaking, I think it still holds relatively well. One of which is the first component, sowing doubt. So these are quotes that I took from these documents that were published by Glantz in his book called The Cigarette Papers, which is well worth a read. Doubt is our product, since it is the best means of competing with a body of fact, quote unquote, that exists in the mind of the general public. It also is the best means of establishing a controversy, and if we are successful in establishing a controversy at the public level, then there is an opportunity to put across what they call the real facts about smoking and health. Obviously not the real facts that they give you lung cancer, but rather the real facts that, it doesn't, apparently. Okay. Second component of this playbook is the counterattack, right? To expose the incredible, unprecedented, and nefarious attack against cigarette, constituting the greatest libel and slander ever perpetrated against any product in the history of free enterprise. Somewhat hyperbolic, maybe. Either way, right? It's better to attack than to defend. Which is to say, if you are able to distract from your own trouble and not be on the defensive too much, that is considered a successful disinformation strategy. And some of you might begin to recognize these strategies in, for example, the things that the Russian Federation does from time to time. Climate fossil fuel companies might do from time to time, and so on and so on. The third component that I think is perhaps the most important one, particularly for the field of research that many of us find ourselves in, is that you should not lie, or at least not too much, right? The quote from the book that is relevant here is, "Truth is our message because of its power to withstand a conflict and sustain a controversy. If in our pro-cigarette efforts we stick to well-documented fact, we can dominate a controversy and operate with the confidence of justifiable self-interest." Which is to say, lying is not a very good idea because you get called out. Which also means that, for me at least, like this focus that our field has had on quote unquote fake news, meaning demonstrably false news headlines, is not exactly fruitless altogether, certainly not, but certainly perhaps a bit myopic, considering the fact that a lot of the disinformation and also the most harmful mis and disinformation that we have seen in the last couple of years has contained kernels of truth that render them convincing to at least some people. And debunking is unsuccessful simply because people are always able to point to certain verifiably correct assertions in support of their belief. So these are things that are worth bearing in mind when you start talking about kind of the theories that underlie why we believe falsehoods. And there's three of them that are kind of, I guess, most publicized. One is the classical reasoning theory, which proposes that people believe misinformation because of lack of engagement with analytical thinking. Some support for this that shows that some studies that show that cognitive reflection or numeracy and so on are related to misinformation belief. I don't think this tells the whole story or even most of the story, frankly, because I think the other two are somewhat more important, the other two dominant theories. One is media consumption patterns. So it's basically exposure fuels belief. And that is more common in, for example, echo chambers in certain environments online, right, where you simply see a lot more misinformation, which because of the illusory truth effect makes it look more convincing, which in turn reinforces belief over time. And then motivated reasoning and partisan bias, I kind of lump the two together because there is a bit of disagreement in the literature over what these terms actually mean. What I mean by these terms is you're more likely to agree with information that your side likes, including misinformation. And also more likely to agree with misinformation that makes the other side look bad. Very simple stuff. There's, decent evidence for all of these things. But I think a couple of insights that we've had in earlier research that we have kind of continued to find in more recent research on misinformation are the following. First of all, persuading people of something is really difficult. What is much easier is exacerbating biases or fueling polarization, right? Exacerbating pre-existing beliefs, making them more extreme, is easier than shifting someone from believing one thing to believing another thing. Second, misinformation works better with, first, longer, and second, more intense exposure in relation to the aforementioned echo chamber effect, right? The more you see it and the longer you are exposed to it, the more persuasive certain mis and disinformation narratives and claims are likely to be. The more persuasive the misinformation, the better. The more you are able to draw on truth as opposed to falsehood, the better it is, right? If you're able to achieve the same goals using truthful, by not lying, effectively avoiding outright lies, that's a lot better. But absurdities will do in a pinch. For instance, the MH17 disaster in July of 2014, right, where the Russian Federation put out a series of theories that were outright false that they made up on the spot to draw attention away from the fact that they were responsible for delivering the missile launch system that shot down a passenger airliner. They had to resort to that. If they didn't have to actually lie, they wouldn't have done it. It's my theory. And finally, the point that I think is often underestimated is that this type of disinformation that we often see, especially the kind that is deliberately produced, is strategic, not ideological. So there is a host of research that nowadays focuses on, for example, US conservatives who are more likely to be exposed to, consume, and believe misinformation and then share it under a whole series of different specifications and study designs, that study finding is robust. What it also is temporary, in the sense that disinformation, for example, by Russia, but by others as well, targets certain groups that they believe are strategically useful to target. And in the past, in the time of the Soviet Union, for instance, these were left-wing groups. And right now they are predominantly populist right-wing groups. And that is for a variety of political and geopolitical reasons that I will not go into here. But either way, it is a mistake, in my view, to see this as the right believes more information than the left kind of debate. Whereas what we should be doing is, why are the people on the right in the United States specifically today being targeted more with mis and disinformation deliberately than people on the left? Okay, so that kind of covers very, very, very briefly and very imperfectly a lot of the kind of underlying kind of theoretical mechanisms that are relevant. But what is perhaps even more relevant is, like, how can we leverage these theories to do something about the problem of mis and disinformation? And what we've arrived at in the last years, say, is that there are two types of layers in which you can even begin to think about intervention. The first is the individual layer, individual level interventions, and the second is the system layer or system level interventions. And with respect to system level interventions, we could think about changing recommender algorithms, right? There was a well-known paper by Andy Guess and colleagues last year in, I believe, Nature or Science, one of the two, it doesn't really matter, where they experimentally kind of put some people, some Facebook and Instagram users, into a reverse chronological feed instead of the regular feed, and looked at what that did for polarization and misinformation belief and so on. And the answer is not much. We can go into the reasons why, but either way, that's an interesting finding. We can think of like business models and legislation, right? The Digital Services Act in the European Union, the Online Harms Bill or Online Safety Act nowadays in the United Kingdom, and the Absolutely Nothing in the United States, where kind of the platforms that we use to communicate are being subjected to more and more regulation to kind of counter the adverse effects of social media usage and misinformation belief and so on, right? Some countries are now banning social media for people under a certain age. And then finally, we have geopolitics, right? So if we asked Mr. Putin very nicely, sir, would you mind, not doing the disinformation thing anymore? He might say yes, and he might stop, and that would actually solve the problem to quite a large degree. It's just that I've tried this, and he didn't respond. Maybe I didn't ask him nicely enough, or maybe there was something off about my Russian. Both things are possible. But more likely is that he simply isn't very likely to listen to some ivory tower scientist like myself from the West, no less. So these are, interventions that we only have limited influence on as individuals, and even as individual scientists trying to contribute to some kind of solution. So instead, what we do very often is we look at the individual level, and that basically means that we achieve or seek to achieve one of two goals. One is either we change beliefs, right, preemptively or post hoc, right? Preemptively meaning we educate people to be less susceptible to misinformation, or we correct misinformation through debunking or source labeling. Or, second option, we hope that they change their behavior, for example, through nudges, right? Which very often, 99% of the time, involves a reduction in the sharing of misinformation with other people. How well does that work? Pretty good, meaning we have quite a lot of lab studies, particularly within the realm of individual level interventions, that show good efficacy, meaning the intended outcome is achieved, which is to say, people are better at evaluating misinformation after the intervention than before, or compared to a control group. The evidence is much more limited for system level interventions, simply because these kinds of interventions are much harder to do and to implement and to test, and much more costly and so on. More on that in a little bit. After roughly 8 or 9 years of research into these interventions, some of which done by myself, but most of it done by other people, we felt, upon invitation by Jonas, thank you for that, by the way, that it was time to look back on this field a little bit and see what worked and what didn't, and what challenges remain for the effective implementation of these kinds of interventions. Uh, and that's generally speaking the distinction between efficacy, which is successful lab studies, and effectiveness, which is real world impact. And we argue that there are six specifically challenges that sort of stand in the way between efficacy and effectiveness. The first is this one, testing effects. So what we found, well, first of all, I should say that this wasn't me necessarily. This was an undergraduate student of mine in Cambridge, and Raccoon Martens as well at Cambridge and now Oxford, who wanted to see for her undergraduate dissertation, so what happens with this testing and retesting effect. Right, so as you can see here, she designed a pretty clever experiment where people were given either an inoculation treatment or a control treatment in the form of a video, right? Once, but then they were tested twice or once, either immediately after viewing and 48 hours later, or only 48 hours after watching the video. And the hypothesis was that this immediate testing increases the intervention's longevity. And is that the case? Yes, absolutely. As you can see here, this is the group that basically this group here at the top, right? Which received an inoculation video and then a test, and then 48 hours later, another test. And you can see that after 48 hours, they were substantially better, to the tune of a Cohen's d of 0.40 and a tiny p-value, than the control group, right? 48 hours after watching the video. Whereas the group of people that only saw the video and did no immediate post-test performed exactly the same, meaning exactly the same as the other two groups, which is to say the effect was completely gone within 48 hours if people were not given the opportunity to rehearse what they learned in an item rating task. We also looked at why that might be the case. And so we, in a second study, which was about a game, not about a video, we assessed a memory task, like how much do you remember from the intervention? And that was administered 10 hours after the intervention with a very similar study design. And we found that the group that had received the immediate post-test and was then retested again 10 days later was significantly and much, much better, to Cohen's d of 0.5, I believe, roughly speaking, than a group which had also been inoculated, meaning played the game, but had received no immediate post-test. Both groups, by the way, were much better than both control groups, which is to say, people who had received a post-test immediately after the intervention were much better at correctly remembering information from the intervention, indicating that people forget quickly without active rehearsal. Now, for games, that's okay. You can implement memory tasks, basically. But for videos and texts and other interventions, we really need to start thinking about how to implement these kinds of things in the interventions, which for videos might be very hard to do, for instance, because people just watch them and then move on with their lives. Food for thought. Second, this is roughly how we test interventions, pretty much. You show someone a tweet or a Facebook post or something else or a headline, and then you have some kind of evaluation. And you hope that this evaluation is more accurate for the treatment group than the control group, for instance, or more accurate after than before, et cetera, et cetera. And we assume that these kinds of item rating tasks translate to real world outcomes in what we consider to be a meaningful way. But this is an assumption. We haven't actually tested this assumption very well. The direct comparisons that do exist, right, between these kinds of lab studies and actual sort of real world impact show, generally speaking, and this is a paper by Stefano Della Vigna and Elizabeth Linos from Harvard, show that this effect might still be there, but it's reduced by a factor of about 6. And that's a lot, which means that for these interventions, if we start out with a small effect size, we can expect it to pretty much disappear very quickly. So bear that in mind. This isn't a call for not having these kinds of interventions at all, certainly not, but it is a call for starting out with robust effect sizes to begin with in the lab. Another relatively important point that we lay out in this review paper is this, where we kind of perhaps overestimate the number of people for whom these interventions are theoretically and practically useful, right? A lot of field studies show middling results or null effects, right? And intervention impact might be very small or it might be fleeting. And here we kind of lay out why that might be, right? Because this is something that we had not seen at all in any other review study or review paper, which kind of lays out these assumptions, right? So with respect to sharing-based interventions and for learning-based interventions, they're roughly the same. For the individuals who are successfully treated, right? That's this group here, the green little box. But that is a group that consists of the following people. Not only people who are in an environment where an intervention can be deployed, for example, social media, who share unwanted content, who share it accidentally or out of ignorance, who are potentially amenable to intervention, who see the intervention and who interact with the intervention as intended, right? Like they watch the video all the way through, they play the whole game or whatever, and they encounter unwanted content before the intervention decays and the effect disappears, which is not an infinite period of time as just discussed. Only those people who are then successfully prevented from sharing, let's say, content with other people that they would have shared had it not been for the intervention, only for them is the intervention useful. Now, that's a small group of people. That group is certainly not zero. We know that from studies, but it is small, which might explain why we keep finding these relatively small effects. The next challenge is the lack of replicability in the global south, which I won't dwell on for too long. First of all, because I'm not an expert, and second of all, because other people have pointed this out with much more eloquence than I am able to. But briefly summarized, we keep failing to replicate our findings in global south countries for a variety of reasons, including study design and an underestimation of the complexities of doing studies in countries you don't understand very well. Interesting food for thought. And then finally, the issue of potential reactants, which aside from this paper by Alexander Johnson and Jens Metzen from the London School of Economics, I have not seen much about, which is how likely are people to even engage with your intervention once they see it? And what they show is that that is subject to certain boundary conditions around the source behind the intervention, right? So here you see that if there is no source for the intervention that is given to people, right, they're about this likely to interact with it, which is fairly good, slightly above the midpoint. And that's roughly the same for a high trust source, such as Harvard. But it is not the same at all for Meta, right? So Meta has a trust deficit here. The Republican Party has a trust deficit. The Democratic Party has a trust deficit. And the Russian government obviously does have a trust deficit, but that's the Russian government, so we don't really care about that. Either way, the point here is they call this inoculation hesitancy, which is to say that we don't really know the social conditions under which people are likely to entertain an intervention to begin with. And we need more research on that. Great. What can we do? We can do many things, thankfully, co-designing interventions with target audiences, investing in field studies, elevating alternative outcome measures alongside this item evaluation task performance, right? Intervention attractiveness, for instance, incorporating system level and individual level approaches together, more on that in a bit. And the latest idea that we had, which is focusing, aside from the psychology, also on the economics of manipulation and try to do something there by interfering with market dynamics. And what do I mean by that? There is a massive, thriving online manipulation market, right? And here in this figure, you can see how many fake followers, views, comments, and likes you can buy for each platform: Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Contacte, and YouTube for 10 euros. And you can see here that, for instance, on Instagram, you can buy for 10 euros, 8,361 fake followers. This is older data. This is from 2022, from my understanding, but the dynamics have not changed that much. In other words, it is really cheap to do this. And disrupting this market, right, is of key importance for countering disinformation, because for the life of me, I can't really figure out a good reason why this should be so cheap, right? But until now, it's been very difficult to track kind of price fluctuations and the effectiveness of countermeasures very well. The final thing that I wanted to mention in my last 1 or 2 minutes of talking are solutions that kind of combine the individual and the system level. And this is a study that was recently published as a preprint by Steve Rache from NYU that I had the privilege of being part of, where Steve wanted to find out, like, what happens if, not if you deactivate your social media, but rather if you strategically unfollow, like a scalpel, certain individuals within your feed. And so we ran 3 studies with about 3,000 participants, roughly speaking. A correlational study and 2 digital field experiments. We tested what happens when you ask people to unfollow certain specific polarizing accounts on X, in this case for Twitter. And we hypothesized that this would reduce out-party animosity and misinformation exposure quite a bit. Idea being that it is certain individuals within your network that are primarily responsible for these adverse effects of social media usage on certain things like social media or misinformation exposure and polarization and so on, not the large-scale use of these platforms by itself. And that turned out to be the case for about a year and a half, or sorry, I should say 11 months, not a year and a half, 11 months. Primarily for people who complied with the assignment, meaning people who continued to unfollow these individuals even after we had finished paying them because they were just happier about how their feed worked. In other words, what we show is that making changes to whose content is shown in social media feeds can impact polarization quite substantially, which is a very interesting finding. Yeah, basically showing that I don't really think that this research showing that not using social media at all is necessarily responsible for reducing polarization and so on, but rather like specific types of social media usage that contribute to this. Yeah, you can see here the final figures sort of from Steve's paper, right? Where you can see here in the unfollow condition where people unfollow certain polarizing accounts, there's roughly this pattern that is visible where people begin to find their Twitter feed more positive, intriguing, educational, etc., and less sad, less divisive, less polarizing, less upsetting, less angry. So that's a positive trend that we were quite happy to see. So that's very nice. It's a positive finding sort of finally about kind of social media research. And moreover, it's nice to see that this intervention is a one-off that has durable effects for about a year, right? You only have to unfollow these people once and then never again, and then that will improve your experience. I wanted to thank my collaborators, first of all, because or last of all, I suppose, because they do a lot of the work and I do very little of it comparatively. So these are some of them. And thank you very much. I look forward to your questions. If you don't get around to asking your questions all the way through today, here is my email. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And yes, we are waiting for questions. Yeah, Jonas.
Hey, John. Thank you so much for this presentation. Very interesting, and nice to see the review paper, in action. That's very nice. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Building on this really interesting review paper that touches upon, some important limitations of the field as a whole. I would be interested in your reflections with regard to these recent approaches where you use large language, interactive capacity with the user to reduce, for instance, quite a deep-seating beliefs such as conspiracy theories. The effect size are pretty strong, seem to be long-lasting, but what is the applicability or the applied value of such an intervention if you would go through the different of your model?
Yeah, I did try to read that paper that you mentioned that was published in Science the other day, if I'm not wrong, like a few months or two ago. I don't know, like they sound a bit too good to be true, frankly, these results, like durable kind of not only kind of belief revision, but like sustained opinion change over time after a single conversation. It that's not really how a lot of these things work. And I'm not a firm believer that large language models are better at this than other humans are, as shown by some other research. So it remains to be seen, I suppose, what replications will show and so on. In the meantime, I'm sort of careful with my opinion formation on this matter. I think like can large language models help and be generally beneficial for sure, because they can be trained to do these kinds of things really well and pretty easily, and that's being done, and that's nice, and I'm happy to see that. I think they have their use in these spaces, but what I don't really believe is that they are better able than other interventions that we have available to kind of jump over these barriers to access or barriers to uptake that we keep running into, right? Because even a conversation with a large language model requires you to opt in to such a conversation where you are open to changing your beliefs and having your beliefs changed by a large language model in a durable sort of conversation, which isn't very different from you choosing to play a game or choosing to watch a video or take a media literacy class and so on. So I don't see the fundamental kind of distinction in that sense of access. Maybe it is true that the findings are much better than others have been able to achieve, which would be great, but then the challenge would still be how do you get people to do that, right? And that kind of the point of the review article was also to point out that we don't really have a good eye on that because we kind of skip that question a lot of the time or kind of expect others to figure it out, which I think we should frankly stop doing and start doing ourselves.
Yeah. I also found it quite striking, and especially that this was published in Science was a bit surprising, due to the applicability problems that it really has. The produce applied value. But I know that some people are kind of seeing it as evidence for an intervention where we could kind of populate social media platforms with bots that that try to counter malicious type of bot armies that already are on these platforms. What are your reflections in this regard?
I mean, as a kid, when I was growing up, I used to watch this program on TV called BattleBots, which is basically robots fighting each other to the death, and there were like some people kind of remote controlling them from a distance, and it was awesome. I really enjoyed that. So I guess kind of a modern reimagining of that type of intervention would be really cool, where kind of bots fight each other on social media and we get to watch. That's a joke, but kind of semi-serious. Sure, if the baddies are using bots, we can fight them with bots too. It's just that what does that do with your social media experience, right? It's already happening that there's a lot of people becoming annoyed with kind of how modern platforms work because there are so many bots and there are so many kind of things that impede your daily experience with these platforms that people are not exactly tuning out, but certainly becoming skeptical, if not cynical, right? Twitter is a very good example of this, which is now bot ridden and many people really don't like it anymore and are leaving. But if you go to Reddit, for instance, I'm like 90% sure that a good chunk of what makes it to the front page of, let's say, Am I the A-hole and other Reddits that are more about sort of personal stories are just bot generated, right? It's a serious problem. So I think like there is a certain kind of expectation of authenticity that I'm not so sure is helped by introducing more bots that are meant to be kind of beneficial to people's experience. But it's also true that you can just have bad bots. So it's a complicated discussion.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Another question? Yes, please.
Yes, hi, Yannick. I'm Jonas, a PhD student. I was wondering what could be the role of social norms in possible interventions? Because in the beginning you mentioned that companies are called out if they lie, and probably then they're also socially sanctioned if people lie. But I wonder whether the social norms might have also changed, and people don't see lying as this bad anymore, and might be a possible intervention to strengthen these norms again.
Yeah, very good question. The awkward thing here is we don't know yet, and it's almost impossible to know to what extent this is simply Donald Trump getting away with lying, right? That's a relatively awkward conclusion where people just don't care if Donald Trump specifically speaks the truth or to the people that enjoy his political views, what feels true enough and good enough in that way, right? Because it's also true that we are still witnessing kind of social punishment for lying for quite a few people, just not always under every circumstance, but it does happen, right? It's just not to Donald Trump. So we're kind of in this era where we're thinking like, well, Donald Trump gets away with it all the time. How the hell is that possible? It's there is a theoretical possibility that it's simply him that has kind of a basically plot armor almost that most other politicians, including right-wing sort of populist politicians that are molding themselves after Trump, don't really have, not exactly the same level of protection. So I don't know the answer to this at all. This is for political scientists to figure out, but it's a possibility. With respect to this kind of post-truth moment that you mentioned and the role of social norms, yeah, I think that's a very good point. Uh, I was hoping to say, I guess I didn't say it clearly enough, that relative to outright lies, if you have the option of not lying, but saying exactly the same thing without telling a lie is usually better. Um, which I think that kind of holds, but of course it doesn't like at scale, you'd rather not do either, right? And the social norm should be to do neither rather than, well, if you're going to manipulate people, just don't lie, right? That isn't the right social norm to foster here. Very complicated question. I wish I had a better kind of view of the psychology of social norms to give you a better answer than that. But unfortunately, my knowledge and skills in this regard are pretty limited. Uh, yeah, I don't know much about social norm formation and so on. I wish I did. I guess I could read up on it. Thanks for the
thanks.
question, though.
Any other question?
I have one. So it was kind of exciting to see those part about, for me at least, those part about the prices for different interactions on social media. And
Yeah.
I that many people don't even realize, like using social media, that you can buy those, and they kind of believe all of those likes, followers are real. So it would be very exciting if more people are aware of this phenomenon, I would say. And I have a very specific question, kind of connected to that. Part which is also kind of misinformation spreading is via paid advertising on social media platforms. Usually those misinformation is directed into kind of stealing money from people, obviously. But it seems like platforms like Facebook have no incentive to fight that. So they are pretty happy to take money from people who just want to scam other people. And I many times myself reported some clearly unethical advertising, and Facebook always respond with, "We didn't remove this ad because it doesn't, because it follows our policy and." And actually, I think that security research community also noticed that, and Facebook is pretty happy to remove their post about this phenomenon. So it seems like they know what they do, and they don't want to fight this kind of misinformation. Have you noticed it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think like they're happy to fight kind of like outright falsehoods, pretty much, like false political claims and so on. Like as for example, they ban political advertising before elections, right? Important elections and so on. Like they don't like there's a lot of money in political advertising just before elections and they ban it. So they're kind of it shows that they're at least semi-serious about that aspect. It's just that I think that once it exits the realm of politics where they are super careful, the reason being that they don't want to get accused of political bias, which is what happens usually if you start fact-checking political misinformation, especially if it's not outright false, right? Uh, Outside of that realm, there's less punishment, social punishment, if you will. There's less pressure on Facebook to do something. And I'm singling out Facebook, but like they're not unique. And as you say, right, like there's plausible almost deniability in terms of the terms of service, maybe. And so that means that they take it less seriously. So I think like they I'm not really 100% sure where I land on it. Like I'm not a believer that the tech bros, many of them, some are, but not all of them, are exclusively motivated by money. they're also motivated in part by social status and so on and so on. And that you can say that that's also in the end kind of another ploy of making money. I don't really want to get into psychology of, these kinds of motivations because it's too difficult. But either way, they are susceptible to kind of input to a certain degree when it comes to implementing interventions, which makes me mildly optimistic about their willingness to cooperate and listen to scientists and so on. It's just that it's also true that you can only go so far, right? You can't really tell them like your algorithm's off. It's messing people up. You need to reverse the algorithm or do something completely different, right? They're going to be like, well, I don't know, but we can, we can pre-bug people or we can do media literacy, right? That's much safer oftentimes. Again, like I don't want to be too cynical about it because I think broadly speaking, their motivations, like they're not kind of a radically different class of people most of the time than you or I are, with respect to kind of our ethical or moral compass. So I think they can be reasoned with, but they are much easier to reason with when there is public pressure. And so, yeah, how that gets raised, I'm not so sure. I hope at least that this kind of platform where you kind of make clear the costs or the cheapness, if you will, of doing these kinds of manipulation campaigns for which there are no kind of justifiable reasons beyond kind of spreading disinformation or making a cheap buck, would increase that pressure and hence also the willingness to cooperate. Again, this is an optimistic view, so we'll see, I guess.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you very much. Is there any other question to Jan? If no, then thank you very much. I would like to first thank all our speakers. So Filipe, Venchao, and Jan, thank you for
Thank you very much.
for joining us. And just to inform everyone that the transmission will be available in the form of many different clips on our YouTube channel. So thank you again and bye-bye.
Bye.
Intensive day.
Are we offline already?
Yes, right now we are.
Które jutro zaczynamy tutaj jakieś...
So Jan, could you say a bit about the program for tomorrow?
So tomorrow, we can be flexible, but first we have a session on the app development with Poznan team. Then I was thinking that we can have a steering committee, but we already, I think, settle on the issue of our second conference in Krakow, the second half of April with Rafał and with Mikołaj. So we can have so later we can have this conversation with Olga.
She'll be at 3:30.
Yeah, okay.
30.
So she will be here at 3:30, and I was speaking previously with Michał, so his people will be available at 3:00, right? Or we want to do that earlier, right? 1 a.m. maybe?
When would you like them to be available?
Okay, but we're saying that it should be early stages, so maybe 1 o'clock.
About 1 hour.
Yeah, would an hour be enough for that?
And then we will, that makes sense. With lunch, we can go discuss with Ola, iron out some details and basically we're done.
Yeah.
So
And in the afternoon, we can come back to up and make some kind of a wrap up and action plans.
And what about us?
What I said, I don't think there's time, but well, two things. I'm just thinking that.
But
Are we blowing out the time needed for these activities? Because if not, we can condense them in the first
we
part
can-
of the day. That would be
we
great.
are open for, but let's say in the plan, we have first meeting on the app between 9 and 12:30. So after 12:32 after the lunch, you can have a time and you don't miss anything. And you are not, let's say, obliged to join our meeting with Aleksandra Nabożny. If you have something more important to do, I think
We'll see.
keep it.
Because you're gonna just work together, or do you want to have something to discuss with?
They want me to show something in art, so some analysis. That's it.
So from 12:30 to 2, you will have 1.5 hour, yeah. And later on, additional time if you.
But do we need to be all together for this conversation with Aleksandra Nabożny, or maybe she can she connect with us earlier? Or is she here?
No, unfortunately, she's commuting from Gdańsk to Warsaw, so she's on the train. So that's why she asked. She said if you could try to connect, but from Pendolino, probably the internet will be spotted. So that's why she asked about this spotting.